On the morning of June 23, 1984, a 9-year-old girl was found murdered in a wooded area adjacent to a residential neighborhood in Paso Robles, California. The victim had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her body was discovered by a dog walker approximately 14 hours after she had last been seen alive, riding her bicycle near her home. The crime scene was contained, photographed, and processed according to standard protocols. Evidence was collected methodically: soil samples, fiber evidence, biological material. The investigation that followed would be characterized by the kind of procedural discipline that inspires public confidence in forensic science. Within 48 hours, detectives had developed a preliminary suspect profile. The perpetrator was likely familiar with the area, possibly a local resident. The crime bore hallmarks of opportunity rather than premeditation, a chance encounter that escalated. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood systematically, interviewing residents, documenting movements, constructing timelines. They were building not merely a list of suspects, but a spatial and temporal map of the crime itself. 3 days into the investigation, a name surfaced repeatedly in witness statements: Michael Hanline, a 26-year-old man who lived approximately half a mile from where the victim's body was found. Hanline was unemployed, recently separated from his wife, and had been seen in the vicinity on the day of the murder. He drove a vehicle that matched a general description provided by a witness who reported seeing a car near the wooded area that evening. The alignment was not perfect, but it was sufficient to warrant further scrutiny. Detectives interviewed Hanline on June 27th. He was cooperative, albeit nervous, a demeanor that investigators noted but did not find particularly unusual under the circumstances. Hanline acknowledged being in the area on the day in question. He had been visiting a friend, he said, and had driven past the general location where the victim was last seen. He denied any involvement in the crime. His account was vague in places, his timeline imprecise. He could not provide a detailed alibi for the critical hours between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. The forensic evidence began to accumulate. A criminalist from the county laboratory examined fibers recovered from the victim's clothing. Under microscopic analysis, several fibers were found to be consistent with the carpet material from Hanline's vehicle. The match was not definitive. Fiber analysis in the mid-1980s offered associative rather than individualized conclusions, but the consistency was documented and would later be presented as corroborative evidence. Additional fibers from the victim's clothing were compared to samples taken from Hanline's residence. Again, consistency was noted. Biological evidence proved more complex. Semen was recovered from the victim's body and clothing. Serological testing indicated the presence of blood type A antigens, shared by approximately 40% of the population. Hanline was a type A secretor. The test could not conclusively identify him as the source, but it could not exclude him either. In the lexicon of forensic serology, he was consistent with the profile. This phrase would appear repeatedly in lab reports and courtroom testimony. A witness emerged whose account would prove pivotal. Mary Donovan, a neighbor who lived near the crime scene, reported that on the evening of June 23rd, she had seen a man she believed to be Hanline walking along the road adjacent to the wooded area. The identification was not immediate. Donovan came forward only after seeing Hanline's photograph in a local newspaper article about the investigation. When shown a photographic lineup, she selected Hanline's image with what she described as reasonable certainty. Her statement was recorded, signed, and incorporated into the growing case file. By mid-July, investigators had assembled what they considered a compelling circumstantial case. Hanline had proximity, opportunity, and no verifiable alibi. The forensic evidence, while not individually conclusive, formed a pattern of consistency. The witness identification provided direct observational support. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and determined that it met the threshold for criminal charges. On July 18, 1984, Michael Hanline was arrested and charged with murder with special circumstances. The prosecution's case was structured around interlocking layers of evidence, each component reinforcing the others. The fiber evidence suggested physical contact between Hanline and the victim. The serological evidence placed him within a subset of the population that could have been the source of the biological material. The witness testimony placed him at the scene. His inability to account for his whereabouts during the critical hours created a vacuum that the prosecution would argue was filled by the commission of the crime. At trial, the forensic testimony was delivered with the authoritative clarity that characterizes expert witnesses trained in laboratory sciences. The criminalist explained the fiber comparison process. How fibers were mounted on slides, examined under compound microscopes, compared for color, diameter, cross-sectional shape, and polymer composition. The fibers from the victim's clothing and those from Hanline's car were, in the expert's professional opinion, consistent in all observable characteristics. The implication was clear without being overstated. These fibers could have originated from Hanline's vehicle. The serologist testified to the blood typing results, explaining the ABO system, the concept of secretor status, and the statistical frequency of type A blood in the general population. The semen recovered from the victim could have come from Hanline. It could also have come from millions of other men, but Hanline was the one sitting in the defendant's chair, and he was the one who could not be excluded. Mary Donovan took the stand and recounted what she had seen on the evening of June 23rd. Under direct examination, she described the man's height, build, and clothing. She explained that she had initially been uncertain, but that upon reflection and after viewing the photograph, she became confident in her identification. The defense challenged her on cross-examination, pointing to inconsistencies in her initial description and the suggestive nature of seeing Hanline's photo in the newspaper before the lineup. But Donovan remained composed. She had seen what she had seen. The defense presented an alibi, but it was diffuse and unverifiable. Hanline testified that he had been driving around aimlessly that evening, trying to clear his head after an argument with his estranged wife. He could not remember exactly where he had gone or whom he might have encountered. No witnesses corroborated his account. The defense called character witnesses who testified to Hanline's nonviolent nature, but character evidence carries limited weight against physical and eyewitness evidence. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They requested to review the fiber evidence and the serological reports. They asked for a readback of Mary Donovan's testimony. On the 3rd day, they returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The foreman's voice was steady. The courtroom was silent. Sentencing followed 3 weeks later. Given the special circumstances finding, the prosecution sought the death penalty. The jury, in a separate penalty phase, voted for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Hanline showed little reaction. His family wept quietly in the gallery. The case file was closed. The investigation had been thorough, the evidence sufficient, the trial procedurally sound. The community, shaken by the murder of a child, found a measure of closure. The system had functioned as designed. A dangerous individual had been identified, tried, and removed from society. Justice, it appeared, had been served. The accommodations of coherence. The fiber evidence, while presented at trial as a point of scientific convergence, had required interpretive flexibility. The criminalist's report noted that the fibers recovered from the victim's clothing were consistent with samples from Handline's vehicle, but the language of consistency occupied a broad spectrum. Fiber comparison in 1984 relied on visual and microscopic assessment, color, thickness, cross-sectional morphology, but these characteristics were not unique identifiers. Thousands of vehicles manufactured in the same year with the same interior options would have contained indistinguishable carpet fibers. The defense had raised this point during cross-examination. The criminalist conceded that the fibers could not be individualized to Handline's car specifically. They could only be said to share class characteristics with that carpet type. When pressed on how many other vehicles in the region might contain identical fibers, the expert offered an estimate, possibly hundreds, depending on make, model, and production year. The prosecution, in redirect, reframed the testimony. The question was not whether the fibers were unique, but whether they were consistent. They were. The jury was asked to consider this consistency within the larger constellation of evidence. What received less attention was a secondary fiber analysis conducted by a second laboratory at the defense's request. This independent examination found fibers on the victim's clothing that did not match samples from Handline's vehicle or residence. These fibers were light blue, synthetic, and of a type commonly used in commercial or industrial settings. The prosecution acknowledged their presence, but argued they were likely transferred innocuously, perhaps from a classroom carpet, a friend's home, or any of the dozens of environments the victim had occupied in the days before her death. The fibers were classified as irrelevant transfer evidence and excluded from the evidentiary narrative. The defense attorney had requested further investigation into the origin of these unmatched fibers. The motion was denied. The court found that such an inquiry would be speculative and unlikely to yield probative results. The fibers that fit the theory were emphasized. Those that did not were contextualized into irrelevance. Mary Donovan's identification of Handline carried significant weight, but the circumstances of that identification contained troubling irregularities. Donovan had not initially mentioned seeing anyone on the road when first interviewed by police on June 24th, the day after the murder. Her statement from that interview focused on sounds, a car engine, possibly a door closing, but included no visual observation of a person. It was only after Handline's arrest was reported in the local newspaper, with his photograph prominently displayed, that Donovan contacted investigators to say she now recalled seeing a man who resembled the suspect. When shown a photographic lineup on July 22nd, Donovan selected Handline's image but expressed uncertainty. The detective's notes from that session recorded her statement. "It could be him. I think it's him, but I'm not completely sure." By the time of trial, 8 months later, this uncertainty had resolved into confidence. On the stand, Donovan testified that she was quite certain the man she saw was Handline. The defense highlighted the evolution of her certainty, suggesting that media exposure and the passage of time had distorted her memory. The prosecution countered that initial hesitation is common in witness identifications and that reflection often clarifies recollection. The question of suggestiveness was raised but not pursued aggressively. The photographic lineup itself was examined by the court and found to be adequately composed. 6 individuals of similar age, build, and coloring. The fact that Donovan had seen Handline's photograph in the newspaper before viewing the lineup was noted, but the judge ruled that this did not render the identification impermissibly suggestive. Witnesses are often exposed to suspects through media coverage. The legal standard required that the identification procedure itself be fair, not that the witness's prior exposure be sterile. What was not explored in depth was Donovan's visual acuity. She had been standing approximately 60 yards from the road in early evening light, for a period she estimated at 3 to 5 seconds. She wore corrective lenses, but had not been wearing them at the time of the observation. During cross-examination, she acknowledged that without her glasses, faces at that distance appeared blurred, but she maintained that she could discern build, posture, and general appearance. The defense did not commission an expert analysis of viewing conditions, distance, and visual resolution. It was treated as a credibility question left to the jury's assessment. The timeline presented by the prosecution placed Hanline near the crime scene between 6:30 and 7 p.m., the window during which the victim was believed to have been abducted. This timeline was supported by Donovan's testimony and by the absence of any confirmed alibi from Hanline. However, a witness who lived 2 blocks from the wooded area reported seeing the victim riding her bicycle at approximately 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes after the prosecution's established abduction window. This witness, a teenage boy, had been walking his dog and was certain of the time because he had checked his watch to ensure he would be home before a scheduled phone call. The prosecution did not dispute the witness's sincerity, but questioned the reliability of his time estimate. Memories of time are notoriously malleable, they argued. The boy might have glanced at his watch at 7:15 but actually seen the girl earlier. Alternatively, he might have seen a different girl on a similar bicycle. The victim's bicycle was a common model, blue with white accents, widely owned by children in the neighborhood. The defense pressed the point, noting that if the victim was alive at 7:15, Hanline could not have been responsible for her abduction at 6:45. The prosecution suggested that the boy was mistaken. The jury was left to weigh testimonial contradictions without physical evidence to resolve them. The serological evidence, too, contained an overlooked dimension. The semen sample had been tested not only for ABO blood type, but also for enzyme markers, which provided additional subcategorization within blood groups. Hanline's enzyme profile was consistent with the sample, but so were the profiles of approximately 10 to 12% of the male population. The criminalist testified to the ABO match, type A, but the enzyme data was mentioned only briefly and not emphasized in closing arguments. The defense did not highlight this statistical limitation, perhaps because it still left Hanline within the pool of potential contributors, or perhaps because the nuances of enzyme polymorphism seemed too technical to resonate with jurors. More significantly, a portion of the biological evidence had degraded during storage. The sample had been refrigerated but not frozen, and summer temperatures in the evidence facility had fluctuated. By the time the defense's independent expert examined the material, certain enzyme markers were unreadable. The expert noted this degradation in his report, but did not testify at trial. The defense had intended to call him, but procedural issues related to witness availability led to his exclusion. His written report was submitted, but not emphasized. In post-trial motions, the defense cited these inconsistencies: the unmatched fibers, the timeline discrepancy, the witness identification concerns, as grounds for a new trial. The motion was denied. The judge's written ruling acknowledged that the evidence was not without ambiguity, but ambiguity is not synonymous with insufficiency. The standard for overturning a jury verdict is exacting. The jury had heard the evidence, weighed the contradictions, and reached a conclusion. Appellate deference to jury findings is a structural principle of the justice system, rooted in the belief that 12 citizens collectively are better positioned to assess credibility and weight than a single judge reviewing transcripts. The inconsistencies were not suppressed. They were presented, examined, and absorbed into the larger narrative. Each was met with a rational explanation that preserved coherence. The system's commitment was not to eliminating doubt, but to determining whether doubt was reasonable. And in the architecture of the case, these fissures were judged too small to destabilize the structure. The logic of resolution. The Paso Robles Police Department, in the summer of 1984, operated under constraints common to mid-sized municipal law enforcement agencies. The investigative division comprised 7 detectives responsible for all major crimes within city limits. Caseloads were managed through a triage system that prioritized crimes by severity and solvability. A child homicide occupied the highest tier of both categories. It demanded immediate resource allocation, sustained attention, and, crucially, resolution within a time frame that satisfied public expectation. The pressure was not explicitly articulated in departmental memos or command directives. It did not need to be. The murder had generated sustained media coverage. Parents kept children indoors. City council members called the chief's office. The reassurance required was not abstract, it was operational. The community needed to be told that the person responsible had been identified, apprehended, and removed from circulation. This need structured the investigation's trajectory in ways that were both invisible and determinative. When Han Lin emerged as a viable suspect on the 4th day of the investigation, the case acquired direction. Leads that had radiated outward in the initial canvass began to converge. The investigative tempo shifted from exploratory to confirmatory. Detectives returned to witnesses and asked more pointed questions. Had anyone seen Han Lin in the area? Did his behavior seem unusual? The questions were not improper, but they carried an implicit hypothesis. Witnesses who had not initially mentioned Han Lin were asked whether, upon reflection, they might have seen someone matching his description. Some said yes, their statements were documented. This narrowing of focus was consistent with standard investigative practice. Resources are finite. An investigation cannot pursue all possibilities indefinitely. Once a suspect emerges who satisfies preliminary evidentiary thresholds, investigative energy consolidates around either confirming or disconfirming that hypothesis. The problem arises when disconfirmation becomes structurally difficult, when the machinery of case building creates its own momentum. The forensic evidence was subjected to this logic. The criminalist who examined the fiber samples understood that consistency is not identity, but the prosecutorial framework required translation. Scientific uncertainty, expressed in the conditional language of laboratory reports, was converted into courtroom certainty through the alchemy of narrative construction. The fibers were consistent with Han Lin's vehicle. This fact was not false, but its presentation minimized the statistical reality that consistency describes a class, not an individual. The conversion was not dishonest, it was functional. Jurors needed to understand what evidence meant in the context of guilt, not in the abstract realm of forensic possibility. The unmatched fibers presented a challenge to this narrative coherence. Their existence suggested that the victim had been in contact with an environment or individual not accounted for in the prosecution's theory, but investigative resources had already been committed to the Han Lin hypothesis. To pursue the origin of the unmatched fibers would require canvassing industrial sites, schools and commercial buildings, an open-ended inquiry with no clear endpoint. The decision to classify them as irrelevant transfer was defensible within the logic of resource allocation. Not every fiber tells a story. Not every anomaly merits investigation. The system depends on judgments about what is probative and what is noise. The district attorney's office operated within its own set of structural imperatives. Conviction rates are a metric of prosecutorial effectiveness, tracked internally and reported publicly. A high-profile case that does not result in conviction is not merely a loss, It is a visible failure that invites scrutiny and criticism. This creates an incentive structure that favors charging decisions supported by evidence sufficient to meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, but also sufficient to withstand appellate review and public perception. The decision to charge Hanline was made after careful review of the case file. The evidence was circumstantial, but circumstantial cases are routinely prosecuted and won. The prosecution's theory was coherent. Hanline had opportunity, proximity, and no verifiable alibi. The forensic evidence, while not conclusive, was consistent. The witness identification, while not perfect, was credible. These components, taken together, formed a narrative that met the legal threshold for charges. The decision to proceed was not reckless. It was calculated within the norms of prosecutorial discretion. Once charges were filed, the adversarial system imposed its own logic. The prosecution's role is to prove guilt. The defense's role is to create doubt. This division of labor presumes that truth will emerge from the collision of opposing narratives. But the system is not symmetrical. The prosecution controls investigative resources, has access to law enforcement expertise, and benefits from the institutional legitimacy of the state. The defense, particularly in cases involving court-appointed counsel, operates with constrained budgets and limited access to independent experts. Hanline's defense attorney was competent and experienced, but the structural disadvantages were significant. The independent fiber analysis required funding that had to be petitioned from the court. The request for additional investigative resources to trace the unmatched fibers was denied on grounds of speculative utility. The defense expert who noted degradation in the biological evidence was not called to testify, partly due to scheduling conflicts and partly due to strategic calculations about the persuasive value of technical testimony. These were not failures of individual effort. They were the predictable outcomes of a system in which defense resources are allocated incrementally and justified retroactively. The jury's role in this structure is to serve as the ultimate fact-finder, but jurors operate within cognitive and informational constraints. They are presented with competing narratives, filtered through evidentiary rules they do not fully understand, and asked to render a verdict based on instructions that frame reasonable doubt as a high but not insurmountable bar. The psychological research on jury decision-making suggests that jurors construct coherent stories from the evidence presented and select the narrative that best accounts for the known facts. The prosecution's narrative in Hanline's case was simpler and more complete than the defense's. It had a clear protagonist, a linear sequence of events, and a resolution that accounted for the forensic evidence and witness testimony. The defense offered doubt, but doubt is not a story. It is the absence of one. The post-conviction review process operated according to its own structural logic. Appellate courts defer to jury verdicts except in cases of clear legal error or constitutional violation. The standard is not whether the appellate judges would have reached the same conclusion, but whether the trial record supports a rational basis for the jury's decision. The inconsistencies raised by the defense in post-trial motions, the unmatched fibers, the timeline discrepancy, the witness identification concerns, were acknowledged but deemed insufficient to overturn the verdict. The trial judge had allowed the evidence to be presented. The jury had weighed it. The appellate court's role was not to retry the facts, but to ensure procedural integrity. This deference is not arbitrary. It reflects a foundational principle of the adversarial system, that the collective judgment of a jury, having observed witnesses and evaluated evidence in real time, is entitled to respect. To allow appellate courts to overturn verdicts based on reweighing evidence would undermine the jury system itself. The trade-off is that factual errors, once embedded in a verdict, become nearly impossible to dislodge through procedural means alone. The case's closure served multiple institutional functions. It allowed law enforcement to report a solved homicide, contributing to clearance statistics that shape resource allocation and public perception. It allowed the district attorney's office to demonstrate effectiveness in prosecuting violent crime. It allowed the community to believe that the person responsible for a child's death had been held accountable. These were not trivial outcomes. They were the objectives for which the system was designed. But the system's design also creates feedback loops that reinforce initial conclusions. Once a suspect is charged, the machinery of prosecution generates documentation, witness statements, forensic reports, trial transcripts that solidifies a particular version of events. This documentation becomes the case's official record, the basis for all subsequent review. Evidence that was minimized or excluded during investigation does not appear in that record and therefore cannot form the basis for appeal. The system's adversarial structure presumes that all relevant evidence will be surfaced at trial, but this presumption depends on equal access to investigative resources and expert analysis, conditions that rarely exist. The failure, if it can be called that, was not localized in any single decision or individual. It was distributed across the investigation, the charging decision, the trial preparation, the jury deliberation, and the appellate review. Each stage functioned according to its design parameters. Each actor operated within the incentives and constraints of their institutional role. The outcome was not the result of corruption or malice. It was the result of a system optimized for resolution rather than perpetual inquiry, for closure rather than sustained uncertainty. The wrongful conviction, viewed from this perspective, is not an aberration, but a predictable output of structural logic. The system is built to process cases efficiently, to convert ambiguity into verdicts, to transform the chaos of crime into the order of legal conclusion. That it sometimes converts innocence into guilt is not a failure of the system's operation, but an exposure of its foundational assumptions. The persistence of certainty. Michael Hanline spent 36 years in California state prisons. The duration itself is difficult to contextualize. It exceeds the average human lifespan in many historical periods. It is longer than most marriages, most careers, most residential tenures. It represents the entirety of a generation. When Hanline entered prison in 1980, Ronald Reagan had just been elected president. When he was released in 2014, the Internet had restructured human communication, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and the world he had known had been replaced by one he did not recognize. The psychological literature on long-term incarceration identifies a cluster of adaptive mechanisms that emerge in response to institutional confinement. Inmates develop narrowed perceptual fields, attuning to the micro-rhythms of prison life, meal schedules, count times, yard access, while losing capacity to process complex or unstructured environments. Emotional regulation becomes muted, trust in external systems erodes, identity consolidates around the fact of imprisonment. These are not pathologies, but survival strategies, cognitive adjustments that make chronic confinement psychologically bearable. For Hanline, the adaptation was complicated by the insistence on innocence. Most inmates, even those who maintain innocence publicly, eventually reach some internal accommodation with their conviction. The psychological strain of sustaining absolute denial over decades is severe. It requires maintaining two incompatible realities: the legal fact of guilt, affirmed repeatedly through appellate denials and parole board reviews, and the internal certainty of innocence. This cognitive dissonance does not resolve. It becomes a permanent condition, a structure of thought that organizes experience. Hanline's case was reopened in 2013 due to efforts by the California Innocence Project, which identified irregularities in the original investigation and obtained access to evidence not previously examined by the defense. A reanalysis of the forensic evidence using more advanced techniques found that biological material from the crime scene, when subjected to DNA testing unavailable in 1984, excluded Hanline as a contributor. The fibers, re-examined with updated comparative databases, were determined to be less probative than originally presented. Additional investigation uncovered an alternative suspect, a convicted sex offender who had lived near the crime scene in 1984 and who could not be excluded by the DNA evidence. This individual had not been investigated during the original inquiry. The exoneration process was procedurally complex. The district attorney's office initially resisted reopening the case, citing the strength of the original conviction and the finality of jury verdicts. After months of legal maneuvering, a hearing was convened. The judge reviewed the new evidence and issued a ruling vacating the conviction. Hanline was released on April 24, 2014. He was 69 years old. The language of exoneration implies restoration, but the reality is more ambiguous. Hanline left prison with no housing, no employment history that extended beyond his mid-20s, and no social network outside the institutional relationships formed during incarceration. The state of California provided a compensation payment, approximately $1.9 million, calculated at $140 per day of wrongful incarceration, but financial compensation does not address the existential dislocation of re-entry. He had to learn to use a smartphone, navigate the internet, understand contemporary social norms. Tasks that others perform automatically required conscious effort and produced recurring failures. The psychological term for this condition is institutionalization, but the label does not capture the phenomenological experience. Hanline described in a deposition given 2 years after his release a persistent sense of unreality. The external world felt provisional, as though it might be revoked at any moment. Sleep remained structured by prison rhythms. Loud noises triggered hypervigilance. Open spaces induced anxiety. These were not metaphorical difficulties but somatic responses inscribed in nervous system patterns developed over decades. The social reintegration was equally fraught. Family relationships, maintained through limited visits and monitored phone calls, could not simply resume. His children had grown, married, and built lives that did not include space for a father who had been absent for their entire adulthoods. The grief was mutual and unspoken. They wanted to welcome him, but they were welcoming a stranger who occupied a symbolic role, father, without the relational history that gives that role meaning. The awkwardness was persistent and unresolvable. The broader community response to Hanline's exoneration was characterized by institutional acknowledgement without accountability. The district attorney issued a public statement expressing regret for the wrongful conviction and emphasizing the office's commitment to justice. The statement did not identify errors in the original prosecution, assign responsibility for the investigative failures, or explain why the exculpatory evidence had not been discovered earlier. It was an apology in the passive voice, acknowledging harm without specifying agency. No one was disciplined. The detectives who had investigated the case were retired. The prosecutor who had tried it had moved to private practice. The forensic analysts who had testified were no longer with the lab. The system that had produced the wrongful conviction had diffused responsibility so thoroughly that accountability could not be localized. There was no villain to punish, no single decision to reverse. The failure belonged to the structure, and structures do not face consequences. Hanline filed a civil suit against the county, alleging misconduct and constitutional violations. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, with no admission of wrongdoing by the defendants. The settlement agreement included a confidentiality clause that prevented Hanline from publicly discussing the specifics of the investigative failures. The legal resolution, like the exoneration itself, provided financial compensation but not narrative closure. The story of what had happened and why remained officially unresolved. The question that haunted Hanline, articulated in interviews conducted years after his release, was not anger but incomprehension. He could not reconcile the fact that people, detectives, prosecutors, jurors, judges, had looked at the evidence and concluded with certainty that he was guilty. The certainty was what disturbed him. Not that they had made a mistake, but that they had made it with such conviction. The system had not failed because it was uncertain. It had failed because it was certain. This is the lesson embedded in the architecture of wrongful convictions. The system does not produce injustice through doubt. It produces injustice through the elimination of doubt, through the conversion of ambiguous evidence into clear verdicts, through the institutional imperative to resolve rather than to question. The wrongful conviction is not an error in the system's operation. It is an outcome of the system's design. Hanline died in 2023, 9 years after his release. He had lived longer outside prison than many exonerees, but the years were marked by the cognitive and emotional residue of incarceration. The certainty that had imprisoned him, the certainty of investigators, prosecutors, jurors, and judges, had been proven false, but it had already accomplished its work. It had structured 36 years of lived experience, had shaped identity and possibility, had determined the course of a life. The certainty was not malicious. It was procedural, institutional, necessary for the functioning of a system designed to resolve cases and deliver verdicts. But the damage it caused was no less real for being systemic. The wrongful conviction stands as a reminder that certainty, when institutionalized, becomes indistinguishable from truth, and that the difference between the two is measured not in evidence, but in lives.